Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this very important conference at this really critical time. My name is Geoffrey, Beattie and I'm a psychologist. So the brief from the IPA was pretty simple. They wanted me to do a spot of mind reading of the public. So COVID-19, what's left to say about it? Quite a lot if you're a psychologist. We're more vulnerable than we've ever imagined. Have we ever had such vivid dreams? I kept a dream diary during the lockdown, and every night I was tormented by these dreams. So the subconscious is working overtime. It's an external threat. And of course, we've been reared for years on healthy lifestyles and an internal locus of control, ways of preventing illness and heart disease and cancer. But this is all different. This is an arbitrary killer. Although, of course, there is a correlation between social class, ethnicity, and mortality. And also, I think, from a psychology point of view, it's really emphasized that we're all interdependent, but of course not able to connect in the normal ways except remotely. It's taught us that trivial things can be life-saving, like washing your hands. My mother always said it was important. Now I believe her. And also safe and comforting things like hugging and shaking hands can be killers. So we have to be wary of everyday behaviors. And of course, the world of luxury products and lifestyles seems, temporarily at least, very remote and unimportant. We're more dependent on technology and the online world. My computer is my friend, probably my only friend. So psychologically, we're more vulnerable, we're more conscious of our everyday automatic behaviors, we're less in control, we're more disempowered, more dependent on others, and at the same time, more wary of the other. Again, during lockdown, it was fascinating watching people's facial expressions as I approached them to share a tiny space with them, incredibly wary of other people. We're less dependent on luxury items and occasions for social signaling, but of course that doesn't take away our underlying narcissism and our fragile concept of self. So that will require other routes to find realization. I don't think I've ever seen so many online charity runs, charity walks than ever. People still want that affirmation, but not for what they're wearing at the moment. But of course, there are many positives as well about COVID. We're reminded of higher values, sacrifice, frontline health workers without PPE, new types of heroes in our communities, helping each other, people volunteering, understanding bystander apathy. And we're reminded of the importance of the family social bonds. There's a stronger sense of community, and people have talked about the wartime spirit. As well, of course, there's a reappraisal of fundamental values. Are there going to be more greener values when this is all over? But that's the big question. Is this all going to be like a dream? It's just going to be over one day. We're going to have forgotten about what we dreamt. That's the really interesting question. And I think if we're going to be serious about an answer to this, we have to consider two main issues. One is, as I say, is the nature of the human mind. And the second one is the nature of COVID-19. It's not just a virus. It's a huge socio-cultural and psychological event with very different effects on different people. So the nature of the human mind, well, let me start with the basic stuff that you all know anyway. Two basic systems. One is called System 1, not the most attractive name, but System 1 is automatic, fast, impulsive, unintended, and unconscious. System 2 is intentional, slow, controlled, reflective, and conscious. And that's the explicit system. Of course, it's not all emotional information that's processed through System 1 and the right hemisphere. It depends on the nature of the stimuli. Simple stimuli, all System 1, all right hemisphere, but more complex scenes, situations, passages require a lot of the left hemisphere as well. Now, System 2, the example that's always given, and I will do the same example, is give someone a maths problem and how do they do it? They don't do it automatically and unconsciously. They do it deliberately with thought, etc. 17 times 24. I've got a very small audience today, and I'm not picking on them to answer that question, but you can all try it at home. That's a really obvious example of System 2. I will show you some examples where System 2 should be working later on in the talk, and yet it doesn't seem to be working on its own, and that's quite surprising. So I'll show you a kind of surprising example in a few minutes. Now, how the two systems align is also interesting. Now, again, this is a very well-known example. A bat and a ball cost £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? About 80% of people say that the ball costs 10p and the bat costs £1, because that kind of adds up to £1.10, and they do it quickly and instinctively. And the statistics are about 80% of university students give exactly that answer. But of course, that's not actually right. The correct answer is the bat is £1.5 and the ball is 5p. So that's the correct answer. Now that's a very well-known example, and it's very well known for a good reason. It tells us a lot of things. It tells us that people often give a quick answer that looks and feels right. In other words, it's a system 1 answer. People tend not to check. And the weird thing about system 2, the great cognitive system, it endorsed this intuitive answer, which could have rejected with a small investment of effort. So this tells us something really important about system 2, which is it can be very lazy. How do the systems work? Well, this is how system 1 works. I'll show you a word of a concept and just think about it. Bananas. I had one on the train coming down today. And here's the next word, vomit. So system 1, how does it work? It works on association, the great associative machine. So you connect those two words up. Your mind assumes a causal connection between the two words. You will have experienced a temporary aversion to bananas. In fact, if you were here physically present today, I might have done this as a test. I could have offered someone a banana to watch their face and see whether they accept the banana or not. I suspect they wouldn't have. And the state of your memory has changed. So if I give you the following little task, complete the following word. Here's a word with one letter missing. Please fill it in. Because of what I've just said, most of you will say sick. You could have said sock or sack, but you were thinking about sickness and vomiting and bananas, so you said sick. So this tells us all about this weird thing that happens all the time to us, which is associative activation in neural networks. We get emotions generated, surprise, in terms of the connection, first of all, and then we get an automatic cognitive response, which psychologists call priming. You're more likely to recognize objects, concepts associated with vomit and bananas. That's just the way it is. And we can prime both actions and thoughts by events of which you're unaware. The nature of the human mind, two systems. The interaction's critical. One system's conscious but lazy. The other is unconscious and a workaholic. System 1 guides, lazy system 2 likes to accept. So if we want to understand the implications of COVID, we need to keep some of these basic points in mind. Now, a critical aspect of this whole thing is attention, because attention is a really important mechanism of the mind. Now, people talk about attention as if it's one thing, but actually there are different kinds. There's all the types of attention associated with vigilance, sustained attention, alertness. That's all about intensity. But then there's focused attention when we're really focusing on something in front of us. And then there's divided attention when we're focusing on something, but we're also listening out for other things as well, or dividing our attention between two things. Now, in terms of the hemispheres in the brain, the right hemisphere is responsible for every type of attention except focused attention. That's left hemisphere dominated. So the right hemisphere dominates exploratory attention. It controls where attention is oriented. We hear a noise, we orient towards it. But the left hemisphere's narrow focused attentional beam is directed by the right hemisphere, but the left hemisphere dominates focused attention. So in terms of the systems, system 1 guides system 2. If system 2 is depleted, if we've got a lot on our minds, a lot to worry about, to think about, system 1 becomes more prominent. So you can see how this might be connected to COVID. Associative connections, all of those little connections between bananas and vomit or build up over time, and this gives rise to an implicit and unconsciously held attitudes. And psychologists measure those in a computerized classification task called the implicit association test, or IAT. We measure normal attitudes just asking people to report them. But these unconscious connections can't just be reported because we don't know them. And these are measured using this IAT computer test. So that's something about how the mind works. What do we know about COVID? Well, it's, as I say, a sociocultural event with a huge psychological dimension. If you want to understand its effect, we have to think about a number of aspects of COVID-19. First of all, in terms of memory and images, I think the first point is that finding out about COVID was a growing and gradual realization. We saw the images from Wuhan, we saw the images from Italy. So system 1 didn't generate its most powerful memory, which is a flashbulb memory. The kind of thing that we have with 9/11. We all know where we were when we saw the images of 9/11. And we remember not just the images of the planes going into the towers, we remember the physical setting of where we were. And that's a weird kind of memory. And it's the brain saying, look, this event is so important and so surprising, so consequential, that you have to remember all the details so you can avoid this situation in the future. That's not the kind of thing we have for COVID. But what we have instead is these incredibly powerful images of people on ventilators, wards struggling to cope, processed by System 1. The reason those images are so powerful is that they affect risk perception. If you have a very clear image of something, you overestimate the probability and the recency of it happening. Very, very important. But as well as the images, we had a whole series of messages coming both internationally and nationally. The World Health Organization, the message in March was COVID-19 impacts the elderly and those with pre-existing health conditions most severely. One interpretation of that, of course, is that virus does not really, inverted commas, affect young people. Now, that was a very, very important message with enormous psychological implications for people's processing of all of the information about COVID. With the new clinical data, the message changed to the virus does not discriminate, but it was too late then. What it didn't take into account was cognitive biases. A big aspect of System 1 are all of these shortcuts it uses for processing information. There are three main biases related to COVID. One is what's called the affect heuristic. For young people, the affect wasn't nearly as negative as for older people. In other words, it was something which was almost trivial. And the affect heuristic guides what you say. Then there's confirmation bias. Once you start behaving in a particular way, you look for confirming evidence. And then the third one, which is probably the most interesting of all, is this thing called the optimism bias. And of course, we know immediately that did it have an effect on behavior? It did, because the research during the immediately after the messaging came out suggested that 16 to 24-year-olds had low or limited concern about COVID compared with adults 55 and over. The younger group were 4 times as likely as older adults to ignore government advice. And then, of course, surprise, surprise, COVID started spreading more quickly amongst the young. Now, optimism bias is a really extraordinary aspect of what it is to be a human being. All of us seem to suffer from it some of the time, but some people suffer from it all of the time. So ask most people, and ask them about, if they're about to get married, you say, do you think your marriage will succeed? This is how many marriages end in divorce. They always overestimate the probability of theirs working. Ask people in startup businesses whether they're going to be successful. Yes, they will be successful, even when they know the statistics. And they will overestimate the probability of having a long and happy life. I, as I say, do a lot of work on climate change, extraordinarily acute optimism bias when it comes to climate change. People think that will affect other places. It's called a spatial bias, or future generations, a temporal bias, but not themselves. But as I say, optimism bias is more extreme with some people rather than others. And we've been doing a lot of work into where it comes from, why it develops, and why it might be important. How might it operate with COVID? One thing we did was we asked people to read climate change messages online. And these messages had arguments for climate change, and arguments for climate change, let's be clear, are bad news, bad emotional effect, they're depressive. Or against climate change, oh, they're much more positive emotionally because it's saying, oh, the science might not be all that good. And we used eye tracking to analyze individual fixations 25 times a second. And we end up with a whole series of hotspot analysis. And that's just some with people who are optimists, dispositional optimists on one side and non-optimists in the other. The red spots indicate hotspots of fixation. And you can see when it comes to climate change, when people know it's climate change they're reading about, optimists read less. They skim over it much more quickly. And which bit do the optimists focus on? Oh, they focus on the science against climate change. The non-optimists read more carefully and they focus on the arguments for climate change. And the results were incredibly significant. The effects of this attentional bias are absolutely really interesting because we tested people's memory for these messages. The non-optimists, 2/3 of them said it was about arguments for climate change. That's the message they got. Whereas 2/3 of the optimists said, oh, the articles were about a debate between positions. So optimism bias seems to be connected to System 1 processing, seems to be affected to attention, but the attention affects what you remember. So that's one aspect of optimism bias. The other aspect is our brains are very interestingly set up. Research done looking at neural imaging as people estimate the probability of experiencing various negative events. They're asked to say the probability, then they're presented with the real information. Optimists are more likely to change their estimate only if the new information was better than originally anticipated. So in other words, if they're given bad information or stuff which is worse than they expected, they simply ignore it. And when I say simply ignore it, it's really interesting because actually their brains actually ignore it. So there's a reduced level of neural coding of undesirable information in a critical region of the right frontal cortex. So this right hemisphere, the silent hemisphere, seems to be really important. It's keeping us all happy, sometimes against the critical information that we should be attending to. Another aspect is communication. Now, everyone, I'm sure, agrees that the communication has been a little bit confusing. And then, of course, there's social isolation, another aspect of COVID. Feelings of isolation, disconnection, etc., with implications for mental health. Loss of human contact, touch and comforting, things that we relied upon to get us through the day before. Greater reliance on technology. And people have reflected, it makes us more self-conscious, we get Zoom fatigue. But of course, I think it misses a really important point about everyday communication, which is it's the really spontaneous bits that are most important, the immediacy and spontaneity. It's when people interrupt each other because they want to show enthusiasm. I mean, when it comes to interruption on Zoom, it's horrific. You want to make facial expressions when people talk. Again, horrific. People might not notice it. You crack jokes on Zoom and it's like a delay before anyone responds. So it's that aspect of communication and social isolation that's been removed from us. And I think, again, there's going to be real implications for post-COVID from that. And then, of course, there's fear and individual adaptation that COVID hasn't gone away. And a second wave's hitting many countries now because things didn't work. And of course, fear is now increasing. Now, fear is really interesting because if people believe that they can themselves do things and engage in certain responses which are going to make a difference, then that's a way of dealing with fear. And I think at the start of the pandemic, self-efficacy and response efficacy were kind of okay. But of course, if fear is increasing and you're thinking those things didn't work, how do you deal with fear now? And again, the psychology suggests that people react in different ways. There's something called defensive avoidance. Too scary, don't want to think about it. Just not going to think about it. Denial, it won't happen to me. Reactance, it's becoming very prominent. They're just trying to manipulate me. A lot of conspiracy theories going about at the moment. Or it's about blaming the other, blaming people who don't seem to be engaged in particular ways. And of course, fear is then transmogrifies into anger and so on. So I think this is another aspect of the whole pandemic crisis, and also something about, with enormous implications for what it's going to be like afterwards. So how things have been changing so far. System 2, the cognitive conscious system, has been depleted because there's so much to worry about, so much to think about. When that happens, System 1 becomes even more active. More cognitive biases, it's in survival mode, more survival attention. We're noticing all kinds of strange stuff. A really important point is that groups and individuals respond differently. We're not all in the same boat. Many social relationships have been made more fragile by what's happened. We're keeping connected, but it's not the same. We're missing all of those behaviors. There's a need to regain feelings of control. And if I've heard one conspiracy theory in the last few days, I've heard a dozen. Everyone wants to be first to know the news. And why is that important to them? Well, they want to feel that they're regaining some control. They're hearing the real version of what's behind all this, and they want to tell people. They want to reposition themselves in the social hierarchy with this information they now know. We need to find new ways for self-affirmation and approval. It's almost as if, fancy clothes, fancy watches, they're not doing the trick any longer. People are wanting to find new ways. And of course, we're also in a state of partial sensory deprivation. Everything's reduced to computer-mediated communication. And touch, smell, taste seems to have been neglected somewhat. So the COVID legacy, what is the legacy going to be? Is it going to be like after the Second World War, are we all going to be dancing in the streets now? Well, that's not guaranteed. I think it depends on us. And it depends on all professional communicators, including people who are engaged in advertising, to promote engagement and to build hope with maximum reach. And I say maximum reach because we're not all in the same boat. And we're not all seeing and feeling COVID the same way. And that has to be taken into account. And I think there has to be something about a lighter mood. We have to be able to perceive a difference between what we have been experiencing. So what can we do? Well, I think there's a number of things we have to do. Our head is full of System 1 images. We have to create and enhance new positive emotional images to push those out. I think that's absolutely critical. I think we need to nudge the right hemisphere, the basis for System 1. It's an incredible source of vigilance. At the moment, all geared to threat. We have to get it as promoting exploratory attention. We have to get the right hemisphere focusing on new novel stuff that's going to really get its attention. It will then direct system 2, the cognitive system, for the sustained processing and understanding. Of course, the right hemisphere is also adapted for other levels of processing, meta-processing and metaphor and irony. So again, what we need is strong metaphor, strong ways of saying, which will engage the right hemisphere. And irony is playful discourse. We need to really engage this part of the brain with all this interesting stuff to get it refocused on other things. Specifically, what might work? Well, there's been a lot during the pandemic where it's been focused on the doctors and the nurses and people giving the story. But I think what we need to do is we need to remind them of the lives before that. It's a degree of nostalgia, I think, will work incredibly well. Familiar music's really important because, of course, it's stimulating, it's emotional, it will get the right hemisphere engaged in the decoding, and it's almost a kind of remembrance of things past, really. We have to remind them of family and bonds, touch and smell, your highly sensory experience. And again, if you think of system 1 as the gatekeeper, this will get through to system 1 because it'll be interested in all of this kind of stuff. Separation and grading, but more symbolically enacted, as a complex story that people will want to understand. And I think a big part of that is the spontaneity and sharing of everyday life. This is something we've all missed. But you can imagine, stories, adverts of soap operas, little themes built around it, where part of that is about spontaneity of people engaged at the same time to remind us of that kind of human aspects of interaction that we've all been part of and that we've all missed. And of course, we can also think about a proactive future. I think in terms of our system 2 thinking, we recognize there's so much positive about what's happened. We've all had a stark reminder, realization that our family and social relationships are the most important things. But remember, that is a system 2 decision. So the future, there has to be a joint acknowledgement that advertising and all professional communicators have a role to play in allowing us to regain the personal and social lives that we once knew. But these lives can be better. And I think that advertising has a huge responsibility and opportunity here to do that. And I always love talking to advertisers because you always know, even when psychology neglected the unconscious, you people knew about unconscious processing. And I would say you already know that human beings work on different levels. I don't think never has this been needed more. Thank you so much.